Hello and welcome to Boundless and Bottomless Seas, a project of Regrettable Century, Antifada, and Varmblog, at least in this round, where I explain right-wing thought to you so you can actually do something with it. The last episode we did get a lot of pushback because I just said what the text actually said. And so,
Did you
I
get
got
nasty comments? Is that what?
I got a lot of there's a lot of like I think I don't know this, but they feel MAGA communist adjacent, saying I'm being unfair to Dugin by action and not imminent enough, even though a lot of the critiques actually were imminent critiques, pointing out the structure. Like, you can't make some of these people happy, and that's okay. I don't want to make them happy. I want to make them very sad. So yet, I do think we have tried to be fair to Dugin, because like I said, there's a lot of people who just want to write him off. I know there's a whole debate over how important he is in Russia. It seems like he's being recuperated somewhat in Russia itself now. So I'm going to wonder if people are going to apologize for me for telling me he doesn't matter. In the same way in which like Alex Jones doesn't matter, and yet he does somehow, because Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene are hanging out with him all of a sudden. So,
and we also have, as we've spoken about on the show before, like when the fourth political theory comes out, Dugin doesn't really matter. And then over the subsequent 15 years or so, perhaps like his kind of eccentric irrationalist ideas are not even coming into vogue, but like the moment is meeting his weird theories, especially if you imagine the way that a lot of people on the broader left, let's say, have started to synthesize his thought into their own.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to take it like before we get into the chapter a little bit, and I don't want us to dally too much today because we have taken 9 hours to get through 2 chapters. But I do want us to look at a little bit why that might be, because I've been thinking about this a lot. During times of breakdown, people reach for weird and eclectic theory. In fact, fascism itself is one of those, like, one of the reasons fascism's so hard to identify, whether or not you're reading The Apprentice's Sorcerer or Ziev Sternhill, is you can find elements of fascism in all the political theories that existed at the time. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why you can always go, well, the Confederacy was fascist, or liberals are fascist, or because, but also communists are fascist, because there are degraded forms of all of it in fascism. They are. I mean, it's just all there. It's a melange. It has a different class base. The Marxism, ideological leadership, I'm just going to say, in the Italian case, actually largely came out of Marxist and syndicalists, not out of the right until later.
Yeah.
And in the non-intel like idealist format, it comes out of military veterans and intellectuals,
right?
In terms of its like actual class basis.
Its leadership's class basis, and its support seemed to be I mean, I do think there's particularly in Germany, to a lesser degree in Italy, the support seemed to be people who were what we might call the working poor, but not proletarian. And so who is that? That's like poor petite bourgeois, lumpenized people, the same people that appeal to bonapartism. And I am of the Bukharinite thesis that fascism is actually a kind of bonapartism, which also gives it character both unique to capitalism and also different from it, in that it pulls from earlier ideas, which should surprise no one, right?
I think that's mostly true. I think it stems from it, but it develops into its own thing at some point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree to that, because each instantiation of bonapartism has a historical particularity that codifies it. We just don't study like the ideology of Louis Bonaparte that much. Like,
we
probably should, but you're right, we don't.
Like authoritarian liberal modernizer is like half the bourgeois leaders since like the 1860s, right?
Well, almost always.
Right.
This is my whole reason for pushing back on us just reading the left, because the left critique of the left is useful, but it's also it's actually myopic in a way.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, the left is the only people doing the thinking, everybody else is. I'm like, no, everyone's responding to the same set of fucked up conditions. They have different criterion of winning. They have different goals. But like the right's incoherent right now, just like the left is. But even though everything's moving right, it's also harder for me to say what that is other than vibes. Here's the thing, though: the right has mostly always been vibes. Like, it is not a theoretical apparatus in the same way that most of Marxism or socialism or anarchism, or even to some degree early liberalism is. I don't think liberalism is a theoretical apparatus anymore. But it was.
Yeah, I think it was all the way up until like it's been about 100 years, but it's more or less, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think we don't back on the reading the right aspect of it. It's not even that we don't do like the corrosive, shitty, odious ideas of the right justice if we don't discuss them. It's that if we seek to have a holistic worldview and understand not like ideas in people's mind palaces somewhere, but like the actual social forces and dynamics that create imminently different conceptions of how society works and how society might be organized, should be organized in the future, then this sort of stuff, reading Dugin, if we read it imminently again, if we do that good job, then we're actually helping get at really essential conflicts and contradictions that exist geopolitically, economically, and so on and so forth.
There's a reason why a lot of leftists are attracted to this, other than the fact a lot of them don't really read. So I mean, and I also think when describing why people move to the right, we underplay the personal. We always think it's ideological, but the personal is tied into that. But ultimately, in a weird way, that flips back on itself, because those personal contexts are understood in the larger social context, which indeed are ideological. So yeah, a lot of people who are attracted to Dugin, like, they saw stupid shit in the DSA, or they saw stupid shit within their college Democrats, or they were awakened to the bullshit of American anti-communism or whatever.
Or they see the possibility to tap into an entire seemingly different social world that is like Russia in the post-Soviet period, and the ideas of nationhood and the ideas of politics that are arising in a place that seems very alien to not just the dominant like ideas that exist in our society, but like our society in general. There's this like there's like this orientalizing alienationizing effect that reading Dugin or reading somebody else from like a foreign land can do for people as they're trying to kind of search the horizon right now to make sense of, say, like the Russo-Ukrainian war, right? Which takes the form of appearance of a geopolitical conflict, but as we all know, is like there's a lot going on there.
Well, let's
they also might just be like well, let's say I'll use myself as a possibility, as an example of a possibility. They also could be lifelong people on the left, and they're just like, after their whole life, look back and they're like, I don't know what this has gotten anyone. And then Dugin, at least at first appearance, suggests a kind of a way out, which is not a pure rejection of where you stand. Now, it turns out that there's more to it than just, well, I mean, it's interesting, but there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of right-wing stuff. But yeah, I think people are honestly and genuinely searching for something, and finding another variant of the left is just, at least in the American context, just not enough.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, people can't detect when something smells right and it's not from their own cultural milieu.
Right.
And I actually think this is important, because right-wing politics is based on status quos in some degree, and expanding or consolidating status quos. And if the status quo is not yours, you don't recognize it.
Right.
And look, a broad-based working class movement for socialism doesn't exist in the United States, doesn't really exist in the world. What does
It definitely
exist?
doesn't exist in
Russia.
fucking Russia right now.
Russia exists. Russia very much exists. So instead of like a quote, like a pie in the sky vision of social change, you can just become a Russia stan.
Right. But the problem with all this is that it ultimately is still pie in the sky. It is not
Yeah.
actually all that immediate when you actually start looking at what's actually going on here. I mean, when we get into this, I mean, you know, there's an everything in the kitchen sink nature to this ideology. There's a refusal to deal with the history of these ideas, not just in Dugin. I mean, like, Dugin doesn't cite the fact that he's pulling from, say, Hans Morgenthau and C.H. Carr for multipolarity. He's not going into the original sources. He's going into some of the popular sources in the late aughts because the original sources expose that it has nothing to do with even anti-imperialism, much less Marxism. Like, and that, I mean, I don't. It is hard for me. In some sense, I've said that people read Dugin dismissively, but I do think we do have to have some hermeneutic of suspicion because we've caught him making misleading statements that we have evidence in the text that he knows are misleading.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get back to illiberalism. One of the things that's funny is I forgot that Alain de Benoit is actually where Towards a Fourth Political Theory comes from. So this was the there's an Against Liberalism book, Towards a Fourth Political Theory, that of Alain de Benoit's work. I haven't read. I've read a lot of Alain de Benoit, but I actually haven't read this book. And so I didn't realize that, like, even Dugin's Fourth Political Theory isn't his. It's a Russification of de Benoit's theory coming out of France.
The new French right.
Yeah, the new French right.
The new droit français.
Yeah.
Nouvelle droit français. Yeah.
The Nouvelle droit français and Nouvelle droit Europa or whatever.
Yeah.
Which Europeans, you can correct my pronunciation on everything later.
Oh, they've given up at this point. I don't think.
Hopefully they've completely just given up on my pronunciation in despair and have
like Varnus ideology. They've moved through the black pill of your pronunciations and they're out the other side now. They're embracing them.
As long as they haven't given up for other reasons, then it's good.
Yeah.
So I want to read something. So we've been talking shit about Dugin, but I want to read something where we've agreed so far that he's fundamentally correct. And this is in the end of chapter 2, although this is where we also there's some interesting things here. I'm just going to read this. Liberalism as a whole rests on the individual as its most basic component. Yes. It is these individuals collectively, but in isolation from one another, taken as a whole. It is perhaps for this reason that the hermetic circle of liberalism turns out to be the most durable. Interestingly, for all of this, Fukuyama is wrong. I just want to point out that Dugin actually fundamentally agrees with Fukuyama, that it is the lack of, it is liberalism's ability to, through its what I think what Jason and I would say is decadence, to empty itself of its other virtues into just its atomized individual form. Like, we have lost solidarity, we have lost egalitarity, we have lost
organic community.
We have lost organic community. We've lost
the family.
Yeah, we've lost natural law. Like, we've lost, we've even lost kind of the guiding hand of the market as even a right-wing ideology. Right. So, we've even lost, liberals don't really believe in human reason in a lot of ways anymore.
Right. Yeah, they're rationalists like Dugin.
Right. But they still do believe in the validation of the individual. And you see this in what we, what you and I dismissively call shit libs or rad libs or whatever. But I mean this in a really real sense. Like, they talk about structures, but they only see these structures as manifested in individuals.
And brains. Yeah.
Yeah, and in brains. Like, oh, they talk about systemic structures, but they're like, oh, but if you check your privilege. And I've always been like, that logically doesn't hold. Why the fuck does being aware of your privilege change any of the dynamics that led to that privilege at all?
And even the structural racism or like the shit liberty, right? Like, it all falls back. Its whole means and motive, of course, is a meritocracy that recognizes the individual again, right? So it's not even, it's like getting rid of the bad ideas in people's heads. But the way that that's reflected in the real world is by better people in HR, by like more diverse
Right.
CEO boards and things.
So
of that.
on one hand,
It's actually like it's the logical conclusion or the logical endpoint of individualism. What's left other than to just check your privilege and change everybody's minds and individually, and that will all aggregate into an unconscious collective as opposed to a conscious collective, which is a tyrannical, I guess.
I would go. I mean, I think there's a certain truth to that. But I would say there is a way in which we could have seen liberalism go another way. It just would require that the capitalist elements of bourgeoisie lost 100 years ago. So like, as I sometimes like to cynically say, most of the 20th century is not trying to deal with the fact the bad guys won in World War One.
It's funny. Varn is you're coming very close to adopting Federici's thesis, which I think was better than we tend to give it credit for. Actually,
which Federici thesis? Like,
well, just that like there's a simple vulgarized Marxist understanding of like the bourgeoisie overthrows the aristocracy and makes capitalism and that's better, and that actually the bourgeois revolution is itself a counter revolution. That like there's a certain level of industrialization that didn't have to happen the way that it did, and I think I agree. I mean, it's a moot point because it did happen, but I think it's interesting to like speculate.
This is implicit also in the platypus affiliated society insisting that bourgeois culture and capitalist culture be judged separately. Which implies that even though they would bulk at being compared to Federici, I know they would. But like that like there were other bourgeois cultures that could have won out. I go back and forth on that because when I think about like Aaron Milken's Woods, not Aaron, Ellen Milken's Woods arguments back in the day when she was still alive, arguing about like what the other liberal orders were. Well, the other one that was obviously on hand was French absolutism.
Yeah,
like,
but far too volatile, obviously, to succeed on its own terms.
Right. It's like, well, that one wasn't really like that one wasn't actually all that possible. Ultimately, it self collapsed. So, okay. So we agree with Dugin this rests on the liberal hermeneutic, that the circle of liberal hermeneutic turns out to be the most durable, and he's got a good reason why, and it's actually the same reason that Fukuyama points out. It's the smallest orbit and rotates around a subject, the individual. In order to shatter the circle, we must strike the individual, abolish him, and cast him into the periphery of political considerations. How the fuck do you do that? And this is one of the things that I want to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier about how everything's incoherent right now. People realize there's a fundamental problem with liberalism, not just Marxists, not just conservatives. I mean, like Patrick Deneen realizes it, and like the Catholic integralist around Vermeerkuhl, and so Rabamari realize it. And yet, all these people keep throwing up themselves against the wall, and what happens is their divisions break them apart. Their divisions. So, and the atomized individual, that has a very narrow conception of a person, one that is very convenient for current marketization. As I was talking about, I mean, in some ways, like Dugin doesn't even see how alienating this is going to get, because like today I was talking to someone like how capitalist means of distribution have gotten so individualized through things like the internet that a shopping mall seems positively pro-social comparatively.
That which we were all in the 1990s excoriating as like the death of the social is now,
it feels very social comparatively.
Amazon.com, yeah, for sure.
All right, so liberalism as well. I'm skipping this, but I think this is where Dugin's. I find Dugin pretty insightful when he's writing about liberalism as the ideology. I find him maddening because he doesn't put any of it in in any political economic context. So it's like liberalism just is like a spirit floating around, like sneaking up on you and making you an atomized individual.
Right. Infuriating. Why it's very difficult to read this book, and yeah, you have to. He forces us to do work. People who are interested in the social, people who are interested in history, right? We're forced to pick up the pieces here of what Dugin has left us and construct some sort of like sociological and historical basis for why his critique is, lands correctly.
Yeah,
it's funny that you say that, because like I've been talking about this book with a couple of people who like the person I borrowed the book from, and like I think it's good to read, but it's because you're right. It's because it forces us to do work. Because whenever other people read it, they respond. They come back to me. They're like, "This is gibberish. This is nonsense. I don't agree with this at all." And I realize, oh, that's because you're just reading the words and that's it.
Yeah.
And there's more to do. Yeah. So I think
totally.
I think you're right.
That's a double-edged sword, because we I always talk about it is both a smart way to read charitably, to kind of internally in your head do all the work that needs to be done to make a statement true, but also sometimes like you're making something coherent that actually isn't.
That's true. Yeah.
But
anyway. I actually have a danger in doing that a lot, so this is helpful for me.
Yeah. Liberalism is well aware of this danger. I mean, like, liberalism is aware of anything. But anyway,
that's a very amorphous.
And therefore undertakes one battle after another with all the other ideologies and theories, social, philosophical, political, that encroach on the individual, inscribing his identity into more general context. The neuroses and fears located at the pathogenic core of the liberal philosophy are clearly seen in the Open Society and its enemies, a classic of neoliberalism by Karl Popper. Yeah, I agree with this. This is one of these things where I'm like, I hate it when I agree with Dugin this much, but I really do. It's compared fascism and communism based precisely on the fact they are both ideologies that integrate the individual into a super individual community, into a whole, into a totality, which Popper immediately qualified as totalitarianism. The relationship between totalitarian and totality is often like not pointed out. Having undermined the individual as a constitutive figure of the entire political and social system, we can put an end to liberalism. Okay, but how do you do that, bro? Because everyone keeps trying to, and they keep on crashing on the shores of their own contradictions.
Yeah.
Of course,
one of the problems with at least so far with this book is that like liberalism as a philosophy is taken as a way of thinking disconnected from production, which doesn't factor in at all. So he's just like, well, we should just stop being liberal. It's like, I don't know if you can stop being liberal unless you change, materially how you live.
It's absolutely like the profit system, right? That's at the heart of this. And then of course too, it's reflected in politics, right? So like when we talk about liberalism, like doing things, right? What is ultimately that? It's the US empire, right? Or it's like the collective West or whatever you would call it if you're a Duginite, right? Like there is an actual political basis for this, and it's this like attempt by the vital center and the Biden administration and the moderates within the Republican Party to keep like the liberal world order going.
Yeah, and so far that's just not even. It's not that it's not addressed. It's not even hinted at so far.
Yeah.
Okay. Having undermined the individual as a constitutive figure of we just need in liberalism. Of course, it's not easy to achieve. Yeah, it's not. Nonetheless, it is obvious that the weakest and strongest aspect of the first political theory comes from its direct appeal to the individual, pleading he remain himself by himself in his own autonomous individuality, uniqueness, particularity, and partiality. I mean, it is a weakness because it actually introduces into liberalism a lot of the contradictions that Jason was saying is logically implicit in a lot of the stances, where like you realize that the individual comes from a social context, you realize these things are social constructed, but you still have to focus on it manifested in the locus of the person.
Right.
And, that's where call out impulses come from, or cancel impulses, or whatever the fuck we're calling it now, because we keep on changing what it's called.
We'll change it again soon enough.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely going to change, because like the recuperation of all this language by the right is pretty thoroughgoing now. That means it's time for us to
in regards to Israel and Zionism.
Yeah. Well, the Israel and Zionism thing is one of these things where everyone has been gaslit to the point that all our ideologies are inverting on themselves. All these people who were condemning free speech are now supporting it. All these people who were supporting free speech are now talking about how we shouldn't criticize Israel, and that maybe there should be laws against it. You have Macron, not Macron, another guy with a French name. I hate Trudeau. I don't hate the French name. I hate him.
I hate him less, but yeah, I agree.
The Macron.
It's just because you're not Canadian.
Well, that's yeah, I guess that's true.
But Chrome like basically saying we should all be able to declare ourselves Zionists now. I'm like, doesn't make any fucking sense. Like,
yeah,
like it's a particularist ideology that you're declaring universally.
It's like a fascist international.
Another thing that has been attempted that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't work apparently. Unless it's run under the auspices of the CIA in the post-war period.
Yeah. In any case, the fourth political theory can interpret Popper's phobias in its favor. This led him and his followers to an anecdotal conclusion. Quite tellingly, that his feeble-minded criticisms of Hegel in the spirit of a Smear campaign and accusations of fascism directed against Plato and Aristotle. I mean, I gotta say, like,
go off, King.
I remember, like, I had a professor that really loved that Karl Popper book. Like, he was also a Hegelian at one point in his life, and still was like, we got to believe in truth and the beautiful. But he did sort of like, but his one hesitation was like all those good critiques of Plato's fascism, and I'm like, what do you mean fascism and Plato? That's fucking anachronistic as fuck.
Yeah,
like,
that one's very off. You're talking millennia off, man. It's not even like saying like the Manifest Destiny was fascist.
No, it's like, okay, so any idea of community is fascist. I mean, I don't know, maybe
political power. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe this is the Frankfurt School gone too far. All right, that'd be ironic. Be very ironic to say that Karl Popper is the Frankfurt School gone too far, but nonetheless. Understanding what human fears the most, we can propose a theory that every human identity is acceptable and justified except for the individual. So this is what I fucking like. This is crazy. All right.
This is not so shit. You got to read that again, man. Read that one more time.
We propose that a theory that every human identity is accessible and justified. So we have conservative pluralism, except for the individual. So every human being is valid, even the ones that are mutually self-contradictory. And this is a way to get around the acceptability of individualism and liberalism, because liberalism, because it focuses on the individual, and this is Fukuyama's argument, that everyone different actually can coexist in that at a cost. And Fukuyama does see it as having a cost. This is what people just don't need to fucking read that book. But here we have like, look, we can validate everyone except for the individual and also all the people who oppose us. And we're going to have to ignore the fact that some of these identities are mutually constitutive and diametrically opposed and can't coexist. But whatever.
Like, there's a certain framework, there's a certain sense in which this is rational. Like if you think of Eurasia as a sector of the world, and that has a certain identity, and then Africa has another one, the Middle East has another one, and so on. In that sense, you could see respecting like Islam, and the Islamic civilization is going to be over there, and that's very valid. And we're not an Islamic civilization. But if you think about it too much, it starts to make less sense for sure. It starts to break down.
Problem is individuals identify as Russian and some identify as Ukrainian. And so how does that get itself sorted out?
The other thing is there's an Alan not an Alan Blomification, excuse me. I always associate him because it's another stupid right-wing book. It's the Samuel Huntingtonification of these identities, because every identity is acceptable and justified, including the fact that certain identities have to kill each other.
Well,
Like civilizations.
Like Karl Marx said, between equal rights, force decides.
Yeah,
right. Which is a weird argument, because I'm then like, well, then America still comes back on top. So like, it's
also like now it's the law of the jungle, right? This is our political philosophy now. It's the law of the jungle.
But here's the thing, that this is going to be again sympathetic to the context of Dugin. Actually, like, even though I've been shitting on Dugin the last sentence,
but this is a new sentence.
This is a new sentence, and it like that. It is the fact that the U.S. itself dismantled by disrespecting the institutions it fucking built. All right, like that's the thing that actually enabled all this to go to. Like there is like a true statement in Putin's assertion that the United States is a bad faith actor, and if you'd only been a good faith actor, maybe I wouldn't have been a dickbag. Like, you know, like, and I think like I'm pretty sympathetic when Putin says that, like over and over and over again, because
just the track record from the year 2000 onward reflects that.
Yeah.
Right. That doesn't mean I agree with everything he does or think he's a libertary force of history or any of that horseshit. But I can totally admit when someone's like fairly right that the maximalism of the offensive realism of U.S. liberalism, and I know that's a lot of isms back to back, when combined with the political economy stalling out in the aughts, and what we can now, I think, retroactively see as the fracturing of neoliberalism, which of course is ironic, right? We all started talking about neoliberalism non-fucking stop as soon as it really began to break down.
And we talked about it in a very neurotic way because it was an individualized way. And it's like, you got a neoliberal mindset, and like all these PMCs are neoliberals. It was a very culturalist and sort of moralistic and individualistic, like that post-left vibe, you know?
But yeah, all these people who like, we're opposed to identity politics. Let's have workerism as an identity based off your class origins, not your actual class. And and I'm not PMC because even though I have a university job and a podcast gig or whatever, like those people, fuck those guys too. So like
they're all right wing now, so whatever.
I mean, so would they ever? I mean, would they ever not? I mean, let's.
Hey, the right wing of social democracy is still the left wing of something.
Well, that's true, but I mean,
that's
like,
actually a really good point, and I think far too few people think about that.
Let me put it to you in another way. These people were pinkos, which means red only a little bit, full of streaks of white. So, for those of you who don't get your color metaphors, I'm not talking about their race. I'm talking about the White Army. Yeah. So, like,
real proto-fascism, like really existing proto-fascism,
even more so than Plato.
Yeah, even more, if one could believe it.
All right, so yet it is the idea of freedom, and not just the idea of freedom for the same substantive freedom rejected by Mill and his liberal program, which concentrated the freedom from. Yeah, this gets picked up by Isaiah Berlin and that crowd to no end. We must say yes to freedom in all its meaning and all its perspective, including the freedom to be not free. The fourth political theory should be a theory of absolute freedom, but not as in Marxism, in which it coincides with absolute necessity. This correlation denies freedom its very core. No, freedom can be of any kind, free of any correlation or lack thereof, facing any direction and any goal. This is what what people wonder what Dugin's weird symbol is, which is the chaos star, right? Why is it the chaos star other than like Warhammer aesthetics? It's not because he's a chaos magician, although that's implied in the sign. It's that the freedom in all directions is what he's trying to get into with that. All right. But freedom in all directions, when your freedom is like, I like big demagogic imperialist to one my civilization is and I have the freedom to be unfree, motherfucker. I mean, there's a way in which we can accuse Dugin rightly of being the most vulgar kind of dialectician, even though he doesn't admit that he's even doing dialectics. Like,
anyway. But he doesn't even have to be aware of it. He is doing dialectic.
Yeah, but of the most elementary kind.
Well, yeah.
Well, he did study in the Soviet period, so
that's true.
Where he got his dialectics from.
It's a way to get pretty vulgar dialectics. The difference is that freedom is conceived as human freedom, not freedom for the individual, but as the freedom given for ethnocentrism, the freedom of Dasein, the freedom of culture, and the freedom of society, the freedom of any form of subjectivity except that of the individual. See, that's a great bait and switch. This is the thing that Dugin is really good at is X equals kumquat. Like, because I can move these concepts around. And the reason why he can get away with that and do it is actually not him. It's that we have hollowed these ideas out,
Right.
like collectively. Like, if this has any purchase, and the reason why it has probably a lot more purchase now than it did in 2011 or 2009, is that the degeneration of our notions for material reasons, our ideologies for material reasons have broken down more, and our orientations and virtues are much less clear.
Yeah.
Like, and we have, and today it just kind of manifests as like everyone gaslighting everyone else all the time. Like I'm pro using anti-terror laws on rightists I dislike, but I'm also against the existence of the police. What? What the fuck? Like,
That's called
like,
gaslighting yourself, I think.
yeah, well, I mean, self-gaslighting is how all this works, man. I mean, so like if I was gonna rename like Althusserion's book on ideology, it'd be like how to gaslight myself. Like anyway. Okay, so he quotes John Sartre here. I think this is a good quote. Man as an individual is a prison without walls. That is to say, the freedom of the individual is a prison. I mean, look, I know how all these right wingers using like X is the opposite of X because reasons is a long established rhetorical tradition going back to at least C.K. Chesterton, if not like Marcus Aurelius. Like the emperor is a slave, blah, 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 blah.
Sure.
Like, you know.
Or vulgar dialectics.
Yeah, freedom is fraught with chaos, but also open to opportunities. Placed in the narrow framework of individuality, the freedom becomes microscopic and ultimately fictitious. I mean, I actually do kind of agree with this, but I actually don't think you can abolish the individual. In fact, I literally think that's an impossibility.
Yeah.
The individual exists in dialectical tension with society. The two create each other.
Which is why I'm completely lost as to his definition of freedom and as to his definition of the individual and where society even touches upon this. Like,
Remember, he also seemed to think the idea should have human rights. We just got to remind ourselves of that. And I'm not saying that mockingly. Like he really does seem to think ideas have some like causative force that's almost metaphysically real. I'm not just saying that to be like flippant.
Right. I mean, the last I was gonna say the last chapter, but really it was like the last page or two was about that. And yeah, I think you're right. Also, like he wants there to be universals, several universals, but no particulars. But particular universals, but not particulars at an individual. It's like it doesn't make any sense.
Right. It's
worse,
like
in that way, it's even worse than a beginner's dialectic. It's like it's only a half a dialectic.
I'm trying to get back to his definition of freedom, and I'm still not finding one. We must say yes to freedom in all its meaning and all its perspectives.
so the yes to freedom is to create a Dasein of people which you subordinate yourself, but you have created it since you were creating it to a subordination of your own creation. This is where knowing Heidegger makes more sense about
all right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's where I'm lost.
So this is like this existential idea that like we create a people, but in creating a people, we bind ourselves to that beingness of thing that which we created.
And you submerge the individual is submerged within that. So to the extent that there is an individual, it's just like an individualized expression of the larger community.
I mean, never mind that I've always thought this was irrational, even in Heidegger, because it's like, okay, so individuals actually create the Dasein in the first place because it's an individual commitment to your own authenticity and your beingness in a place and in an event that allows that to happen.
Yeah, and why is it that some individuals fall into the Dasein and some don't?
Well, because the Dasein is actually predicated on all individuals. I mean, all human flourishing actually requires humans to be exclusive. So this is like, yeah, he believes in human universals in so much that they can justify particularities and vice versa, but never wants to acknowledge the fundamental tension or even relationship between the two.
Yeah, I mean, it's like he wants it to just go away. I mean, I think part of my desire to make a charitable reading where maybe it shouldn't be is like kind of it seems really to be about asserting the subjective factor again. It's like rather than just being tossed about and just things happening to us, we should create the thing that it's still going to happen to us, but because it's going to be our creation, it's going to be less of a blind force.
All right. I do want to actually, I think part of this argument is very bad faith and stupid, but part of this argument is actually true. Right? This flip side of liberalism at its core is totalitarian and tolerant of differences, most especially opposed to the realization of a great will. Notice this is not an individual will. So this is where, like, when I mentioned Agregors earlier on, why he talks like everything like is like a concept that has a will, he seems to really think concepts have will.
Yeah.
Like that they almost think.
Well, yeah, like when he says liberalism wants and liberalism knows, I think he means that. I don't think it's quite as metaphorical as we would take it to be.
Yeah, we keep on taking it as if it is as if he's using the abstract to represent an aggregate. But no, he seems to actually be, when he talks about great will, he seems to actually be doing something different. All right, let me get into this. It is only prepared to tolerate small people. It protects not so much the rights of man, but rather the rights of small man. This is Nietzsche reinterpreted and made safe.
Right.
This small man can be allowed to do anything, but in spite of all his desires, he will be unable to do anything. Yet because of small man on the other side of this minimal humanism, one can just glimpse the horizon of genuine freedom. Okay, I actually do think that there is a little bit of, even though I think the first part of that is like trying to make Nietzsche more palatable to his readers who are Christian, and not acknowledging that this is Nietzsche. The second part of this, that small man can be allowed to do anything, but inspires his desires will be unable to, is actually true. And I think we see this in the paradoxes of like left liberal actual politics. What happens under left liberal, protest against inequality? They actually tend to accelerate the inequality. The inequality of society actually got worse under Obama and under Biden than it did prior.
Well, and how many police departments defunded anything ever? Like at all? None.
No.
I mean, well, like,
some were defunded, but then they were immediately refunded when they realized they hadn't done anything to actually deal with the social problems that led to the situation in the first fucking place.
Yeah.
Right. And their refunding was an increase in funding.
Right. So, and it's something that, yes, leftists can kind of complain about, but they also don't really point out that it was enabled by them making a demand that they had not thought about what it meant. And I don't just mean they hadn't thought about what it meant to get rid of police. They probably had, but they hadn't thought about what it would take for society to reorganize, where like, you want to get rid of police, we all have to be in part of a security militia, basically. Like, I've been saying this for like 2 years now, and I would support that. Like, I know it's very uncomfortable for me to say like, oh, everybody should have to serve a couple hours every day in a community watch group, but like, you should, God damn it.
Yeah. Defunding the police and reorganizing society is one of the things which I would like to do after and as the result of what we call the revolution. I think it's a good idea. I just don't think it can be in place of the revolution.
Having left the limits of individuality, man can be crushed by the elements of life and by dangerous chaos. See, this is where he may want to establish order, and this is entirely within his right, the right of the great man, a real man of being and time. So we have Heideggerian Nietzscheanism here. All right, so people should recognize the ideology, and it's not just Nietzscheanism; it's Heideggerian Nietzscheanism. From the time period of 1937 and 1942 that we never fucking talk about for some fucking reason.
Yeah,
well,
completely references that time.
What were you saying, Jason?
Oh, that was just back whenever everybody was on vacation.
Yeah. The bearer in this case will be Dasein. The previous ideologies, each in its own way, alienated Dasein from its meaning, restricted it, and imprisoned it in one way or another, making it inauthentic. Each of these ideologies put a cheerless doll, Das Man, in place of Dasein. The freedom of Dasein lies in implementing the opportunity to be authentic, that is, in the realization of sign and more than of Da. Their being consists of there and being. In order to understand that there is located, we should point out and make it basic, a foundational gesture. Yet in being, to flow into there is like a fountain. We must place all of this together, place the entire hermeneutic circle into the domain of a complete freedom. Therefore, complete freedom, however, not for any individual. Therefore, the political theory is at the same time a fundamental ontological theory, which contains with it the awareness of the truth of being at its core.
So Dasein has existed all through the era of modernism, when these other great theories, the first, second, and third political theories, held sway, especially in the 20th century. But all of these others submerged Dasein underneath. And now, for historical reasons, like Dasein can reemerge.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Dasein can reemerge, which is a commitment to the civilization of which you are a part, of which is your true authentic self. And I just want to state that that's what he's saying. I also want to throw Adorno's jargon of authenticity at not that I'm always a big fan of Adorno, but the jargon of authenticity takes this stuff apart.
Mhm.
So it's just like one of the more useful Adorno texts I just want to chuck at good old Dugin's head. All right. Without freedom, we cannot force anyone to exist. I want you we want to talk about paradox. We're going to force people to exist. Even if we build the optimal society, and even if we were to force everyone to act appropriately and operate within the framework of the correct paradigm, we would never guarantee such an outcome. I mean, that's true. This is a result of man's freedom to choose being. Yeah, of course, if you don't choose the right being because you're a spiritual inferior, and if you live in our borders, we have the right to eradicate you. That's what's implied in Heidegger's argument.
Right, okay.
Of course, most often man gravitates towards inauthentic existence of Dasein, trying to dodge the issue, to succumb to gossip, guerre, or self-mockery. Liberated Dasein may not choose the path to being. It may hide in shelter and may, once again, clutter the world in its hallucinations and fears and its concerns and intentions. Choosing Dasein may corrupt the fourth political theory itself, turning into self-parody. I mean, it already kind of is, bro. But this is a risk. But being is a risk too. The only question is who risks what? You risk everything, and everyone puts you at risk. Okay, I'm just going to highlight this because this I think is true, and this is one thing I hate about left-wing safety culture. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Like, it's of the things that we talk about to be safe in all instances and instantiations is impossible. And I don't just mean that because of other people. I mean, we arguably could be safe as other people. We just might get hit by a fucking comet. So, like...
Or we could all live in padded rooms, and we could wear tissue boxes on our feet, and we could...
And still get hit by a comet.
We could still get hit by a comet.
Well, and also, it just happens to be the case that as individuals, isolated entirely from each other, and being protected from the outside world, including even the other people in the other room, and also, even if there's not a comet, there's no guarantee that, like, I'm not going to harm myself, or that you're not going to harm yourself. That
actually it raises
yeah, exactly.
All right, it raises actually the increasedness of harming yourself because you're not designed to be alienated in that way.
We always work with a partner. You always got a partner, and you always tell people when you're using the restroom. So when you're gone for a minute, people don't think you're under a pile of metal or something like that.
Right. I mean,
right, exactly.
There's a reason why. I mean, this is a fundamental truth about human beings. We're weaker than chimpanzees. We don't have good claws. Our teeth are kind of shitty. We take forever to develop. We're basically snack food for 3 years.
Our backs are terrible.
We can't run very fast.
We can't run very fast. We're not as strong as smaller apes of the same like near genus as us, and it's just
we can't hold our breath very long. Yeah.
And yet our ability to cooperate, we took over the fucking planet.
Absolutely.
Right.
So like it is in the ability to cooperate that we did that. Like,
yeah.
So in that sense, I am sympathetic to Dugin, but what Dugin thinks, and look, I actually do think one of the things communists are really bad at dealing with is symbolic mediation as a necessity for human beings. Like, we need things to organize ourselves around beyond just our material reproduction. I think Marx is right that material reproduction is dominant, and no idea is going to come up that does that totally contradicts that material reproduction of society. It won't catch on because it would be self-destructive. But I do think like the idea that this is one thing I'll give Althusser credit for that I wouldn't normally give over a lot of Marxists. The idea of an unmediated relation to the world is fucking foolish.
Right.
Like, you're not going to have it. You can't articulate the world without some form of mediation.
Unless
And-
you're David Jensen and you talk to the salmons.
Yeah, sure. Okay. But I mean, I do think the problem, though, is to take this mediation and give it causal power, which is what I think in some ways liberals do this, actually, but I also think Dugin's doing it in a very literal metaphysical sense.
Right.
And, you know, that is something. Okay.
I mean, which is kind of a breath of fresh air, because at least it's literal, so it can be contended with on the terms that define it. Whereas for most people, you have to convince them that that there are terms to define it, and then you have to convince them that it's wrong.
What I'm finding very compelling about this whole section here is that Dugin is putting his finger on something I think is felt more now certainly than when the book came out, which is like the intense feelings of powerlessness that exists not only like among individuals within the economy, but of course individuals within the political marketplace as well. Like,
Yeah.
you know, Trump allowed tens of millions of Americans to say things that they couldn't say before and make choices that they couldn't make under the previous liberal order. And that in and of itself, I think, showed, you know, that this trap that modern liberalism, decaying modern liberalism, has brought people into. Dugin is picking up on something I think that's very real.
But
And
in that decadence, I think we need to really reestablish some power here, because this is what I want to point out.
yeah,
It's not just that liberals recuperated Black Lives Matter. Liberals also recuperated Trumpism after saying they shouldn't normalize it.
it's true.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Most of Trump's policies have been rebranded as part of neo-progressivism. Robert Brenner almost admitted it, and then back in the Robert Brenner, Dylan Riley piece on
Political,
thesis on Bidenism or whatever. Like, he almost admitted it and then backed down and gave Biden like special neo-progressive capital. I'm like, no, you almost hit it. It actually is an extension of the same thing, because crisis has shifted everything over.
Yep.
Like, it's not the only possibility, but it's the possibility that already happened, which is what they're trying to build on. They're trying to reestablish the old order on top of whatever Trump did,
Right.
which means that it is a classical case of recuperation.
Because fundamentally, the material reproduction of the regime of accumulation that was neoliberalism went into crisis, right? There wasn't ideas in people's head. It wasn't some like Duginist sort of like vulgar dialectic of ideas. It was just that, like, in order to like continue going, you had to break with some of the habits of the past if you're the ruling class.
Yep. This brings us to chapter 3, the critique of the
Hey.
monotonic processes.
It's chapter 4 in my book.
Yeah, mine too.
Yeah.
Wait.
Now, you're including the introduction as a chapter.
I'm reading it doesn't matter.
You're reading the other translation where it is
critique of monotonic processes.
It's really funny because my PDF is chapter 4, but my hard copy is chapter 3.
All right.
Yeah. I have both PDFs. I just checked it. It's chapter 4 in one version, chapter 3 in another.
All right. So that'll help me with confusion later on, because I keep getting confused.
All right.
Well, it will also help the listener. The critique of monotonic processes.
Monotonic means unchanging in pitch or tone. Monolithic or monologic. I mean, like, so I actually don't know why he goes with monotonic and not like other like monolithic or monologic processes.
What does tone do for him that those other things don't?
Yeah, I don't. I guess that it's not human. Like, monotonic is a tone that does not. Humans can't produce monotonic tones easily.
Okay.
It requires no changing in pitch or variability. Okay, the idea of modernization is based on the idea of progress. Thus, we use the term modernize. We certainly mean progress, linear accumulation, and a certain continuous process. We speak of modernization. We presuppose development, growth, and evolution. This is the same semantic system. Thus, when we speak of unconditionally positive achievements of modernization, we agree with a very important basic paradigm. We agree that with the idea that the human society is developing, progressive, evolving, growing, and getting better and better. That is to say, we share a particular vision of historical optimism. Yeah, okay. Well, I just want to say, we don't share that. With the exception of maybe Sean, you have two of the most pessimistic Marxists on the planet. like right here, but I get what he's talking about. And the one thing I will say is I'm sympathetic to the critique of unilinear, unisectional, straight up progress without any demarcation of what is being progressed or not.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with that too. I'm skeptical of that as well. But that is it. But that is still, I mean, it's fading very, very quickly from like political and economic reality. But that still is the underpinning of like the world system, right?
Yeah,
But
definitely.
that's falling to the side just in the way that like the Holocaust and the Nazi regime and World War II was like the foundational event in the post-war order. That too is crumbling before our eyes.
yeah. AKA, as I like to retain this, fuck Steven Pinker. But
Right.
okay. This is
But like seriously, fuck him a lot. Actually.
Yeah, no, fuck that guy.
particularly now. Like now,
Oh
I'm
my
like,
god, yeah.
when he's like, we'll never see World War II levels of anything again. I'm like, well, you're seeing it right now, buddy.
Yesterday, the fucking Russian foreign ministry called the fucking Italians, Germans, French, and British to the floor, to the mat, and told them we're gonna nuke your asses if you really want to start sending troops. Like, and then all of a sudden, like a few hours later, all these press releases came out. No, just kidding. We're not gonna. But like, that's how close we are right now to something that Steven Pinker, even he would admit, would make World War II look like a fucking dinner party.
Yeah.
Right.
Although I also will point out that if you're making those blatant of a threat to nuke people, you probably actually don't mean it.
Yeah. But that's not like the nuclear raid saber rattling isn't something we've had a lot of in the last 35 years. It's concerning that it's back.
It is concerning, but it's also, I want to point out, it's also vulgarizing. I understand why Russia would do it, but it actually implies that they're afraid of a legitimate change in the balance of forces, which would make the war when Ukraine, which is already pretty nasty, a lot nastier.
Yeah.
Because it would go back. So what's happened in the war in Ukraine is actually Russia attempted like a modern war, like the United States tried to attempt modern wars. That didn't go well. So they went back to Clausewitzian artillery stuff, which is working. And that makes sense. They're trying to literally conquer and maintain control over land that's contested. So the best way to usually do that is with bullets, not bombs. Unless you're just trying to, hollow out a population like we see it somewhere else.
I think the attrition factor is really big in it too. I think demilitarization, isn't even so much about territory, although it is, but it's like largely about hollowing out a population and industrial base. But this is like a huge sidebar.
Yeah, but I mean, I do think like this idea that like we weren't going to see that again, and that the early 20th century atrocities were a fluke. Just Gaza and Ukraine by themselves have death rates that, while not at World War II levels of population, are, I mean, in comparative numbers, are still way high compared to even the U.S.'s recent conflicts.
Yeah.
The exception of the population loss would be like the Syrian civil war, because it's gone on for like, I don't know, 12 years.
And they also aren't examples of like dirty war, like Cold War proxy, like massacres of 1 million Indonesians. It's like out in the open, and these are like full on hot wars.
But it also like belabels the view that like somehow multipolarity is going to be more peaceful than bipolarity or unipolarity. Yeah. All right. It is rooted in the scientific, social, and political and social scientific, societal. Okay, uses societal and social worldview of the humanities and natural sciences of the 18th and 19th century, where the idea of progress, development, and growth were taken as an axiom that cannot be doubted. I actually do see this, and I think communism has a more nuanced view of that. There are times in late Marx and Engels' work where I feel like they lose sight of their dialectical movement, where they just sound like, yeah, the industrial capacity is going to increase forever. Like they do sound like that at times. They don't sound like that consistently, and in fact, it actually hurts their argument when they do that shit. But they do it. Like
they do it often enough to where some people think that's the main thing.
Right. You just development of productive forces. In which case, I'm like, why would we just not be liberals then?
Right.
Like,
I mean, that's the question that should be asked continually of the People's Republic of China right now,
Mm.
and they wouldn't have an answer. Well, I mean, not a
I mean,
real
they
answer,
do, but like,
not a convincing answer. I mean,
yeah, it's just that they're gonna meet their production of forces by 2050. Except they're probably gonna have a realization at the Party Congress in 2045. They're gonna need to push it back another 25 years. I mean, that's assuming that all of our nation states are still around in 50 years, but like, or actually 25 years. In other words, the entire set of axiom, as well as a whole historiography and predictive analysis of the 19th century in the humanities and science was built on the idea of progress. We can trace the development of this subject, the idea of progress, in the three political ideologies. Oh boy. Okay, let us take the classical liberalism of Herbert Spencer. Already problematic. He claimed the development of human society is the next stage of the evolution of animal species, and that there is a connection and a continuity between the animal world and social development. I mean, there is a connection and continuity between animal world and social development. That isn't the problem with Herbert Spencer. But the problem with Herbert Spencer is the next part. And therefore, all laws of animal world leading to development, improvement, and evolution in the animal world within Darwin's framework can be projected onto society. No, it can't, because also Darwin was really uncomfortable with the idea that natural selection was constantly improving because conditions were always changing. He did eventually adopt Spencer's language, like he in later revisions of the Origin of the Species, he actually changes some things that were not survival of the fittest to the Spencerian term. So it's not to say he totally rejected it, but he was never comfortable with it because he realized that, like, well, sometimes conditions change and they're just stochastic. Like, there's no progress or regress at all. Shit just changed. Like, and an adaptation that was perfectly fine for you, a few years ago is now going to kill you. Like,
that's the only reasonable position to have about these things, anyways.
Right. Which Spencer, of course, kind of turns on its head because social evolutionism, or social Darwinism actually views. Also, one of the things that I think people miss, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Kropotkin had a tendency towards racialized thought that people ignore. The reason why is he believed in collective evolution and saw nations and races as people groups, even though he validated all of them as legitimate. It wasn't like, but as units of evolution. That's actually more problematic than you realize, because it lends itself to, even though it lends itself to like a communist internal ethic, it also lends itself to social Darwinism, just arguing that communism is going to win the social Darwinist program.
Right.
And the reality, evolution don't work that way. Like, we're not like our nations and species or stuff are nowhere near that discrete. This is the basis of the famous theory social Darwinism, which Spencer is a classic representative. If, according to Darwin, the driving force behind evolution of animals is struggle for survival and natural selection, then the same process must take place in society, argued Spencer. And to perfect this struggle is the survival, interspecies, intraspecies, the struggle for the strong against the weak, the competition of resources, pleasure. The more perfect our society becomes. The question is how to aid this process of selection. According to Spencer, this is a central theme of the liberal model and is the meaning of social progress. This is why eugenics is actually, even though it's not particularly individual sounding, is still actually part of liberal thought. But I'm going to actually push on this a little bit. The degeneration of liberalism into the atomized individualism that we have today actually precludes Spencerian thought pretty much altogether. Like, because how could society progress in social units like this with competing social units if we're all atomized individuals? And that's something that, like, I find interesting. Maybe Dugin does throw it at Spencer, but it seems like that's something that you would he's going to talk about the rational good things in Spencer's series. This is going to be fun. If we were liberals, in the one way or the other, we inherited this zoological approach to social development based on struggle against and the destruction of the weak by the strong. However, the theory contains one important point. He argued that there are two phases of social development. The first phase when the struggle for survival is conducted cruelly by force. This is characteristic of the ancient world. The second occurs when the struggle is carried out more subtly through economic means. Once the bourgeois revolution takes place, the struggle for survival does not stop. According to Spencer, it acquires a new, more advanced, and more efficient forms. It relocates into the sphere of the market, and hence the strongest survive, that is, the richest. Instead of the most powerful feudal lord, a hero, a strong person, a leader. This is where Dugin's like neo-feudalism kind of comes out. Who is simply seizes all that is up for grabs around his community, taking it away, all that belongs to other nations and races, and sharing it with the ruling ethnicity or caste. Now comes the capitalist who brings the same aggressive animal principle to the market, the corporation, and the trading company. The transition from one order of power to the order of money, according to Spencer, does not mean the humanization of the process, but only underscores greater effectiveness. I mean, in Marxism, it's literally the shift from direct domination and oppression to less domination, although domination is still present, and exploitation. Like, and that shift is also, it means that the power relation is mediated through a commodity or a pseudo commodity in the case of money. I know people are going to talk about commodity money, but money hasn't been a commodity for a long time. Not really. So, because it does not have any use values outside of the use value within the system. So it's not truly a commodity. Anyway, that is to say, the struggle in the market sphere between the strong, meaning rich, and the weak, meaning poor, becomes more efficient and leads to higher levels of development until the super rich, the super strong, and the super developed countries appear. Progress, according to Spencer, and more broadly speaking, according to liberalism, is always the growth of economic power, since this continued refined struggle for survival of the animal species, the warfare methods of strong nations, and caste within the framework of pre-capitalist states. Thus, animalistic forms of aggression is embedded in the liberal idea of progress, which is the main trajectory of social development. With more economic freedom, there is greater power for takeovers, attacks, mergers, and acquisitions. Liberal discourse, meaning the analysis of the liberal ideologist, is completely an animal discourse. I mean, I agree with it till you get to that. In such a system, the more advanced law or the more advanced, more modern method of production do not mean they are more humane. What it means is they allow for more opportunities for the strong to more effectively realize their power, while the weak can only work to admit defeat, or if they have any strength left, fight on. In this manner, the modern idea of economic growth, as you see in liberals such as Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, has its foundation.
The two names I have not heard in a very long time.
Yeah, but it makes total sense for when this was written.
Totally.
Has its foundation and origins in the idea of struggle between species, that is, the frail destruction of the weak by the strong, of the validation of the strong at the expense of the weak. Only instead of this conflict between predators and overlords, we have golden billion, and that golden billion, their own king of beasts, the New York Stock Exchange and the world bankers, devour all up for grabs, and at the same time turn the forests of the world into social infrastructure. Therefore, when we speak of modernization in the liberal vein, we necessarily mean the enhancement of social, political, cultural, spiritual, and informational scenario where when the absolute aggression of the strong against the weak can be implemented. That's implicit in right-wing liberalism. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What I find interesting, though, is you have to deal with the fact that liberalism and the atomized individual actually splints against himself here. And I don't think Dugin's talking about that yet, but maybe we'll get to it.
I mean, so far, he's not. He's treating it as a... I mean, it's very hard to disagree with, but I'm going to move on and probably will later.
Yeah. The American liberal Ayn Rand, Greenspan was one of her greatest admirers until he wasn't. I'm just going to point that out.
Another flashback to Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
That was really in the discourse 15 years ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, the right has completely moved on from this. And in some ways, Dugin is presaging one right taking over another. Creating an entire philosophy called objectivism based on the following blunt idea. If one is rich, then he is good. She reached the limits of Weber's idea about the origins of capitalism and Protestant ethic and said that he who is rich is always and necessarily good, almost a saint, while the poor man is evil, lazy, bad,
and corrupt,
a sinner. Being poor, according to Rand, is to be a sinful villain, whereas to be rich is to be a saint. She's supposed to establish a conspiracy of the rich, meaning the strong, bright, sacred, and powerful capitalists, against any kind of labor movement. The peasants and all who would stand for social justice are those who are simply poor. Such a crusade of the rich against the poor is the basis of objectivist ideology. People like Greenspan and the current head of the United States Federal Reserve, Bernanke, are objectivists. Well, Bernanke actually kind of gave that up, but yes. That
Well,
is,
and also just not just Rand, but also like John Calvin.
yeah. Oh yeah. We do have to go into the Protestant origins of that, but
Yeah.
that's how Protestants could adopt Randianism, even though it doesn't make any fucking sense because Rand's like a arch anti-religious
Yes.
thinker.
Yeah.
She's a hardcore atheist.
Yeah, religion means you're going to join a group, and groups equals communism, which is tyrannical.
Right. Exactly. I mean, really, yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm
that is
barely even simplifying it. That's just the argument.
no. I remember reading that when I was 17 years old in Philosophy for Objectivists or whatever that book was, and I'd be like, "That's nuts." All right.
That's so shit.
This is elitism for everybody. That's a weird thing about it, though. Is it like Rand gives you like the powerful will win, then there be a conspiracy against the rich, but you could be part of that conspiracy. Like you can't. All right. If we understand modernization like liberal Democrats, then it means that we are invited to join in the terrible struggle for survival at its greatest intensity and become like them, trying to grab a place at the trough of globalization. Globalization, in this case, is a new battlefield for the survival, the struggle of the rich against the poor. I mean, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
We all said that in the alter globalization movement.
Yeah.
Naturally, the ideological and moral premises of this version of modernization is entirely alien to the Russian people in terms of history and our culture. Oh, yeah, you produced Dan Rand, motherfucker.
I would also contend that it's
true.
also entirely alien to people in terms of all history and all culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, you Russians aren't special.
Yeah, I mean, at least not in this regard. I mean, I don't think you are anyways, but especially here.
Like
everybody hates it for the same reasons.
I was like, we Americans are maybe especially stupid, but like, that's because we're a hegemon. And hegemons are normally dumb.
Yeah.
Because they're hegemons. Because
or
they don't have
in very particular ways too.
Right. Well, I mean, this is a point that David Graeber makes that, despite my general antipathy towards David Graeber, I think he's correct on. Systemic power makes you dumb because you don't actually have to fight anymore.
It also makes you dangerous because you poke a Russian bear maybe for like 30 years after.
And what happens to cornered bears? Even if they can't take you outright, they're gonna maul your fucking face.
Yeah.
So
and I'm not convinced Blinken and Biden and all them are even really aware of how dangerous their behavior is right now. That's the scary part. They're like stupid and malicious at the same time.
Yeah, our elites have. I mean, this is something that I would like get on Dugin on. Our elites are particularly decadent. They're particularly decadent. Like,
yeah, it's almost like a strong men. They make good times, right? But then good times make
to use some right-wing tropes.
Right-wing tropes based off Ibn Khaldun, who wasn't totally wrong. All right. In communism, the idea of unidirectional progress is also present. Marx argued
unfortunately, that's true.
I think that's true, and I think I think it's something Marx is inconsistent on, honestly. Like, because when I read Capital, there's nothing in Capital that indicates that communism's automatically going to win. There's absolutely nothing in Das Kapital that indicates that. And Gramsci pointed that out, like, you know, in Lenin versus Lenin, the rebellion against Capital, which he like says that Lenin disproves Capital because Capital doesn't actually get to a point where it can say this is what's going to undo the relations. It just talks about how vampiric the bourgeoisie are. But
I think a lot of people they think that Marxism is what Kautsky interpreted Marxism to be, and they're related, sure, but there's some slippage there.
Yeah,
and that matters a lot.
Some Marxian and Lassallean hybridism.
Yep.
All right, which leads to the improvement and development of societies and economies, which will soon or later result in communist proletarian revolution, redistributing the accumulated wealth as a result of the development of alienating technologies.
Oh, it's about redistribution, eh?
Yeah, well, this is where, like, yes, Soviet Marxism was like this, dude, but go back and read Critique of the Goethe program.
Yeah, seriously.
But I do think that reading of Marx is not alien to Marx. I want to defend Dugin there. Both things are in Marx. This is where like Althusserians try to make the epistemic break, and like Marxist hyphen humanists try to like pretend that Marx never contradicted himself ever, and it's all coherent somehow from moment one to the end. Like there's no development of thought; it's all been there from moment one.
It turns out
the idea. Turns out neither one of those are true. Like,
yeah, and in the real world, it's a lot easier to go down the road of redistributing commodities than it is abolishing them.
Yeah.
Well, luckily, Marx was just like all other people in that ideas changed and there were contradictions. And I mean, even God, even in the Bible, you can't say that the same ideas in Exodus are present in Acts of the Apostles.
Mm.
Well, that this leads us to some interesting theological problems that I, as a non-Christian, don't really want to get into. But that is where dispensationalism comes from. But anyway, it is telling the lion's share of the Communist Manifesto. Yeah, but it's telling you're also using the Communist Manifesto as your statement of Marx's developed mature philosophy. Anyway.
1847, folks.
Yeah. By Marx and Engels is devoted to criticizing specifically those anti-bourgeois political philosophies which differ from Marxism. First and foremost, those that are feudal reaction. Just admit you're feudalistic, motherfucker. All right, and nationalistic. By doing so, Marx and Engels strove to emphasize their communism was directed against the bourgeoisie in a manner direct from the criticism of the right-wing anti-capitalist. In reality, compared to all other reactionary and conservative projects, Marxism stands on the side of the bourgeoisie and seeking to bring its victory closer, since it translates into the narrative of a historical project and the logic of modernization. This is
the same criticism of Marxism that the Narodniks had.
Yeah. And some of the SRs and also Bakunin. I mean, like, this is an old criticism. One that's not entirely unfair, but also not entirely fair, because there's like the critical current of Marxism is very aware that historical progress is not going to just automatically make this happen.
Yeah, and also Marx and Engels.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, like the experience of 1848 disillusions Marx and Engels and their movement from the bourgeoisie, right? It's clear that the bourgeoisie can't even do the progressive thing it's supposed to be doing after the manifesto.
Yeah, this is not dealing with the ideas of decadence and revision implied in the Brumaire.
Well, but to be fair, if ever there was a part of the world where Marxism developed only in that one direction, it is in Russia. Like from Plekhanov onward, like the linear progressive. That's just what there was at the time.
I mean, and that's the weird dual nature of Leninism, is that Leninism both realizes the problem with Plekhanov thought, but also re-encapitulates it and just makes it like, we're going to do it, but we're going to take charge. It actually ends up making Plekhanov look kind of right, that no, you shouldn't have done that. You should not have actually tried to do the bourgeois stuff yourself. Like, that confuses things profoundly. That was also Daniel de Leon's criticism too. Is like, he accused the SPD of that in 1910. That they were confusing bourgeois and communist revolutions and trying to have both at the same time in Germany, which had not thoroughly gone a bourgeois revolution yet, and that would only happen in the course of World War I, kind of doing it for you. So, like, okay, for this reason, Marxism rejects conservatism in all its forms. I mean, duh. All right. The contradictions between communists and capitalists acquire a particularly acute characteristic as the triumph of capitalism becomes irreversible and complete. It is here that the communists enter history as the vanguard of the proletariat and push historical progress further along towards socialism and communism. Once again, we see Darwinism and Marxism, including the full acceptance of evolutionary ideas and its belief in miraculous power of scientific process and technological improvement. Just so we point out, Dugin is anti-science. Right? Like, has anyone missed this so far? Is this not apparent to people? Like he really does have a problem with Darwinism as a thing. We lived through this kind of modernization in the 20th century. It paid for it more than full. I mean, to be fair, the Russians really did pay for it more than full.
Sure
they paid for it like 40 to 50% of their male population 3 fucking times. All right. I do not have the slightest desire to repeat such experiments. Therefore, this version of modernization will not work, and moreover, no one can speak out in favor of it. Well, this is funny, though, because
his admirers are starting to do exactly that.
Right. I mean, they are doing that. Like, one of the things about this whole MAGA communist Dugin-Marx hybrid shit is that it actually does damage to both ideologies in a profound way. Like, I think Dugin just thinks he can control it. But everyone thinks they can control the stuff that they're duping, that people aren't going to drink, that people aren't, that the Kool-Aid's not going to outstrip you.
Yeah, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. We all watched it. It's a happy feel-good story.
Yeah. All right. Oddly enough, fascism too is an evolutionary movement. We may remember, okay, now he brings back Nietzsche, who he was citing positively before, but now he's like, this is why he was hiding, that's who he was citing. Dugin. All right. We may remember Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, in some ways, like, you have to miss his arguments. And one aspect are being flipped on their head somewhere else when he's like actually made the same argument of someone he's critiquing just a chapter before. Like, there's a way in which Dugin kind of assumes you're kind of dumb.
It's either that or he assumes that you're very smart.
Yeah.
Because in either case, the same reading can apply.
Well, I mean, this might have like a Leo Straussian where like you're either stupid and you're useful, or you're smart and you realize I'm full of shit and you know what I really mean.
Like that bell curve meme where it's like, you know, I'm talking about there's like a smart guy and a dumb yeah.
Well, to be very charitable, because again, I'm just gonna be I'm just gonna lean into that. You're either stupid and you're gonna be useful, or you're gonna be very smart and you're gonna be useful for a different reason. But either way, you're gonna basically you're basically gonna carry forward the same position.
Right. Even though your reasons for doing it are diametrically opposed.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. There's a political movement. This doesn't seek coherence. This seeks power.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does.
Well, and that's how you know it's actually pretty good in that respect, because it's compelling in a way that most other stuff just isn't.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we have the romance of communism, but you know, it's getting harder and harder.
I mean, we have the romance of communism, but almost nobody else actually has the romance of communism.
No, they have the romance of state dependency.
Yeah, exactly.
Shots fired.
Fucking Revenge of LaSalle.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Nietzsche was an evolutionist and believed that his word choices here is interesting. Believed that on the logic of the development of the species, man will be replaced by a Superman, much like how man first came to replace the ape. I mean, we didn't replace the ape though. I mean, like, that's
still there, still out.
Like, the problem I have with this is like Dugin's taking stupid readings of evolution as what evolution is actually. Maybe he's not, but I got no evidence to the contrary yet. All right. Man will be replaced by... Okay, how will this ape be human? A laughingstock or a pitiful embarrassment. That's precisely what humans shall be to overman, a laughingstock or a pitiful embarrassment. I don't know. I don't think a chimpanzee's a laughingstock when it rips your fucking face off. But nonetheless, I don't laugh at chimpanzees. I know them too well.
Seems kind of deranged to do that, quite honestly.
Yeah. Like, I'm gonna
but you know, like most people they do think of themselves as a, you know, superior, and we won, whatever. I think again, I think you could be stupid or you could be very smart. In either way, you could, you know, presumed to be a part of the audience for this.
All right. The National Socialists adopted the interpretation of this idea that the right race was more developed than the black, yellow, or any other kind. No, it didn't. It wasn't the right race. It was the Aryans.
Yeah, that matters a lot, actually. What's really funny is that when, you know, the National Socialists, they didn't just adopt the white race, the Aryan race, as opposed to the Slavic race, which was fit only to either be exterminated or to be slaves.
Are the Semitic races who are also technically Caucasian?
Well, yeah, I just mean like of every kind of critique that a person like Dugin could make, the
reading of American racial development onto Nazism is pretty common. And yes, Nazis did pull from American racial laws. It's absolutely true. No one's denying that. But their notion of race was actually a little different than the American notion of race. And that's missed here.
Yeah.
It's weird, actually, what liberal bullshit Dugin accepts. Like, it's actually very strange. Like, and I'm like, and I often don't know, is this cynical or is this just wrong? Like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, he's like, Dugin is looking at liberalism from a bit of a distance, right? Because already by the time this is published, Yeah, Russia had its liberal moment, and it was terrible. And liberalism is already under the guise of American unipolar hegemony is already like a bugbear in his world. So he doesn't. Maybe he has experience with liberalism when he goes to the West, quote unquote. But like it's already a sort of there's a distance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, it's also just like, but how would someone from Russia who knows that the Nazis were going to exterminate them, but that everyone else considers them white?
I think the only way you could read this is by him doing like closet or like quiet apologetics for Nazism.
But I also
Or
have
at least to have us consider the ideas irrespective of the Holocaust.
I also find it interesting here, though, that like, I mean, he's kind of has to know better. But then I'm thinking but he's not writing this initially for an American audience. He's writing it for a Russian one.
Yeah, but also I even think that the next paragraph does a lot to counter what you just said about the soft apologism.
All right, let's go for it then.
All right, here we encounter the same progressivist outlook along the lines of development improvement, which leads to the assumption of racial superiority on the grounds that white nations have their own sophisticated instruments of industrial production, while other ethnic groups do not. Well, except for when they were not true in case of the Japanese, nonetheless.
Yeah, right.
Today we reject and criticize fascism for its racial component, but we forget that this ideology is also built on ideas of progress and evolution, just like the other two theories of modernity. If we were to visualize the essence of Nazi ideology and the role of progress and evolution in it, he's really got a problem with evolution. He's really got a problem with evolution.
He really does, yeah.
Then the connection between racism and evolution will become obvious to us. This connection in its concealed form can be seen in liberalism and even in communism. If not biological, we see cultural, technological, and economic racism. Okay.
Economic racism.
In the ideology of the free market and in the dictatorship of the proletariat. See,
that's the point I was trying to make. Is like
a crazy way to define.
It's a less coherent position than a soft backdoor Nazism. It's like no,
it's even weirder.
He's not for it. It's weirder than that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Remember, he said that racism was any idea that was supported over another person's idea without logical variance. Anytime you claimed anything was superior to anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. The liberals are the real racists.
Yes. I mean, that was the argument. And in some ways he's not wrong, but in some ways he's also like hiding that like he thinks like cultural competition and whatnot's absolutely fine. And you can turn America to ash and it wouldn't be bad.
Yeah. In some ways he's not wrong, but in other ways he is wrong.
Right. They all view the world and the entire process as linear growth. Marxists do not, I will say this, Marxists do not actually view the world historically as purely linear growth. We don't. Our model is spiral, not linear.
Yeah.
Like, and that's very clear by the time you get to Brumaire and Das Kapital. I think it's not. I can see how it's not clear in the Communist Manifesto. Like, and
there's a reason why Jordan Peterson clings to the manifesto, because that's the only one that he can criticize. First of all, it's probably the only one I ever read, anyways.
Yeah, but I'm almost certain it's the only one he ever read, anyways. But it's also the easiest to criticize, like, because it's the early instantiation of. It's the first instantiation of the ideology in any coherent, complete form.
Yeah.
It's also intentionally simplified for a very specific purpose,
right?
And moved on from kind of right afterward,
immediately. Like, I will always know if a Marxist thinks the most important document in communism or Marxism is the Communist Manifesto. I'm like, you're a child. Like, it's just that's what it's an indication of. All right. They all view the world and the entire historical process as linear growth. No, they don't. They differ in the interpretation of this process and they attribute different meanings to it, but they all accept the irreversibility of history and its progressive character.
Well, I tell you what, if there's one thing that's irreversible, it's history.
Yeah, like, okay. I'm gonna just say, you ain't bringing the Habsburgs back, motherfucker.
He wants to believe that history is reversible, though, right?
Yeah, he does. And like you can believe that history is irreversible and not be a progressive. Like, time's arrow's only forward doesn't mean it's going in a good direction. Like, thus, modernization is a concept that sends us directly back to the three classical political ideologies. What does he just say? He wants to be a feudalist? I don't know. Like, I mean, because he probably doesn't actually, but it seemed like this actually indicates that he does. I don't like.
Yeah.
So this is another area where I'm like very sympathetic because I feel like I can feel what at least I imagine he's has in mind when he's writing this is like there has to be something else. There must be another way. I mean, I don't think that there is, but I can see why you would desperately seek to find that other way.
All right. All three of these ideologies are being gradually discarded. Haha, ours has come back, motherfucker, as has fascism. The revenge of the second and third. But even liberalism is gradually ceasing to satisfy the majority of the world's population. Yes,
that's
absolutely,
definitely
100% true. Even true at the time this was written. It's just gotten way worse now. And simultaneously is turning into something other than what it was during the classical era of modernity. Yes. We call this decadence theory for those of us who are not linearist.
Yeah.
All right. Consequently, it is about the time we pose the question of searching for the fourth political ideology beyond the first three. I always feel like this is like, hey, we have this awesome ideology that is a bunch of random stuff and Heidegger and but also not wedded to anything, and civilizations, but it's perfectly all civilizations are valid except for the liberal one.
Liberalism can't be a civilization, even though it is probably the most profound civilization that has existed in our lifetimes.
I was about to say it's the one that's literally conquered the fucking planet, but all right. Additionally, these radical rejections of the three classical theories reflect our attitude that what is common to them all. That is the attitude towards modernization, progress, evolution, development, and growth. AKA, we're all reactionaries now.
Revenge of the second and third.
I mean, okay, on this, I'm actually somewhat sympathetic. I do think almost all politics is by nature right now reactive to something other than itself, which definitionally makes it a kind of reactionaryism. But there's multiple kinds of reactionaryism. So, like, if you don't believe in liberal reactionaryism, I don't know how the fuck you explain the Biden administration. So
I hate to be the guy, but I think this is probably a pretty good place to stop.
Yeah, we can stop.
My time is.
Yeah, it's been an hour and a half. That's a decent amount.
Yeah.
Of recording. All right.
And also because we're about to start talking about monotonic processes, which is a whole other episode, really.
Yeah. So we will continue on the monotonic and Gregory Bateson and a bunch of random shit. Very soon. I actually do find this monotonic stuff and the Bateson stuff interesting.
Every time we do this series and I pick this up again, I'm endlessly fascinated by it. So it is a great project.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested when we pick some conservative thinkers that I actually am slightly more sympathetic to, like John Gray, who's just a pessimist.
Yeah, I've watched some videos of him recently. He's interesting. I would read him.
John Gray. I don't think I'm familiar. I'm going to look him up.
He's a student of Isaiah Berlin who was like, capitalism's dumb. And
he's still out there. He's still making the circuit.
Oh no, he just wrote a book about. I have it back here. I guess Leviathan. I also want to read like some John Lukács, and some maybe something more normie.
I would love that. That'd be fun too.
We probably should also read The Fourth Turning eventually. There's a lot of books that we need to read. We also have to read like some old school. Like we should actually really have to read Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, because like you can't understand the last instantiation of right-wing thought without understanding that book. So like I have like 20 books we need to eventually cover, but guys,
we'll be done with it by the time we die, maybe.
Yeah, I was about to say this is becoming my other lifelong project is left-wing readings of right-wing material, so that I guess Sam Adler Bell and Stillman, Matthew Stillman, or Sitman. Matthew S. over there at Know Your Enemy are not the only people talking about this. Because I think their viewpoint on what the right is actually very particular to Steelman. I can't remember. Matthew S's religious background and introduction to American conservatism, which I think, unfortunately, a lot of people. I mean, there's this one hand thing that I've complained about where all the Marxists and whatnot are attracted to the right wing thought that's the weirdest because it like justifies our own weird bullshit. But on the other hand, there is a way in which a lot of the old normie conservative stuff that's just dying. Like, so, and we don't know what's going to replace it right now. It's we talk about this on the left, but it's kind of a free for all over there on the right now too. So
for sure, yeah. You got like the step nomads versus the gay bodybuilders versus the
yeah, like John Donovan and what's the other guy? Yeah. John Donovan versus Patrick Deneen versus I mean, I guess the alt-right guys have clearly lost now.
Yeah.
They've all
I had kind of forgotten about the alt-right.
Well, I think Richard Spencer is like a racist Bidenist.
Yeah, he is. He literally is like a racist Bidenist, dude. Of course. Perfect trajectory.
On that note, the ideological incoherence of our age, we thus end today's podcast. Good day.
Thanks, everybody.